environments of law, but the environment of law in the United States doesn't allow withdrawal. But we're going to come on anyway, so.
We'll see where it goes. Thank you, though. Good discussion. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you may be, you're now in the new way. On Steampunk Radio, with 2 E's, on your TuneIn app. I'm Dr. Lenny Time. I've got the regular cast of characters with me, and we're going to give you the next 2 hours of radio in a form that you're just not used to hearing on radio. We're going to talk, we're going to listen to some tunes, we're going to discuss things, but we're not going to stay in the cosmic reality that has been created for us. We're going to explore the boundaries of thought in every way possible. We might even suspend the concept of time. We might suspend the concept of space. But you know, we got to be careful if we get rid of time, because time is the avenger.
In the city. Time, one more vodka and wine. To help paralyze that tiny little tick, 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 tick. When your property took the A train, I wonder where your manners went. You were standing at the station. In your briefcase was your aftershave and underwear. Can you hear the whistle blow? Sounds like Time the Avenger. Harbor in the city. Time to kill another vodka wine. To help paralyze that tiny little tick, 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 tick.
That's me, Time the Avenger. I'm Dr. Lenny Time. I'll be talking with my studio audience and whoever else wants to talk. And we're going to be talking about action. Action is in a personal sense, action at a distance, which Einstein called spooky action. Actions that we can take to change something, actions that we can do to affect something. But what action actually is and what Americans do when they call it action is something that's totally up for debate. And I don't think Americans are quite like other people. I think that there's an information gap between persons who live in the world and most Americans, and that has to do with media. That media creates something that's an illusion, and the illusion of reality and the illusion of sanity that comes through the media is not the same as reality or sanity. So some of us get to take our insanity internally and others get to express it externally. But the question is, if we move ourselves to create change and the rest of the people aren't ready for creating change, are they going to resist the change that we're trying to create? And the answer to that is an obvious, of course they are. Why would we think that if we were going to change something, that if people were comfortable with it and it suddenly started changing, why would they not be uncomfortable with the idea of change? But you see, we've got it all twisted. And our twisted wizard hasn't been around for a couple weeks to help us untwist the stretches of time that have taken us from the previous reality to the current reality to the future reality, which hasn't been invented yet according to the way that we understand time. But the future is based on the past, and what we're seeing are things called Mandela effects, where the future is changing the past so that the basis set of the reality of now can get there from here, wherever here and there are. So we start thinking about the concepts of what it is we're asking people to do. And on one hand, we're saying, give up all those beliefs you were taught. They're not real. There's something else out there. And that's not a really fair way of doing things. But on the other hand, there's a group of people who say, nah, you can't mess with reality. It's always been what it always is. And you have to buy into the current reality, lock, stock, and barrel, and take it as everybody else does and play the game on our terms. And so on the one hand, you have a world where everybody is lost in their own space. And on the other hand, you have one space for everybody to fit in. And if you're lost, you better get back into the line and come back into our space, which is also called Facebook. And the more people in Facebook who believe what Facebook is telling the patrons of Facebook, the more an external reality exists that has nothing to do with the reality created by Mark Zuckerberg. And when I use Facebook, feel free to substitute Google or Alphabet or YouTube or any other social media that is a social construct by a group of people trying to influence opinion. It works. Obviously, it works. You wouldn't have Freud and Bernays and some of these other people, and you wouldn't have the depth of depravity that the current system has gone to pull the wool over the eyes of the disadvantaged who cannot see it for what it's worth. But what is it worth? In what terms do we measure worth? And how do we even know that something's going on out there? What it is isn't exactly clear, but you look and say, hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's coming down. And the only thing that's coming down is the rain again, because it does rain here, and water is the one consistent thing that we have in our world. So instead of asking what would Jesus do, maybe we should ask what would water do? And water does some pretty amazing things. And one of the things water does is it always seeks its own level. And so, therefore, you know that if you have a surface which water is in a bowl, there's a surface that is essentially flat. Even if the bowl is on a slant, the water ends up being on a slant with the bowl so that it's not perpendicular and it makes a pattern where it's essentially a flat water. So if we can have flat water, why can't we have flat Earth or flat moon or flat sun or flat everything? In fact, it's just a perception, and whether the perception is right or wrong depends on your perception of right and wrong. So we live in a duality where both sides of the coin are possible. And, I bet there's been a coin flip in a football game where the coin landed stuck in the mud on its edge, and they had to reflip the coin because they didn't know what to do. If it lands on its edge, you give both teams the football to start the game and play a double football game. Wouldn't that be cool if you had 22 guys on the field at all times for both teams, and the offense and the defense had to work simultaneously while the other team was going on? So your offense could be playing with two footballs, and that would mean that, what would that mean? No, we don't even want to go there. We don't want to pop the bubble of Americans following professional sports, because if we told them that all sports was meaningless and ridiculous, they would just get mad at us and tell us we just hate the Cowboys and the Steelers. But it's really the Yankees we hate. But then again, they're from New York. It's easy to hate them. No, the idea of how you want to do things in the world of sports is you want to use sports as a performance measure. And professional sports has the best system of performance measurement metrics you've ever seen. You can take any professional sport and look at the statistics that they keep on that sport and get an idea of the performance level of the professionals playing that sport. And in fact, to prove that mathematically was one of the things I set out to do. So I took to following sports, which I've always done, but I selected a new sport. I'm following English football. And I'm following English football because Americans don't pay attention to soccer. And if it's called soccer, we Americans are biased and we say our football is much better than your soccer. But everywhere else, all over the world, football is soccer. And for Americans to think they created football and stole the term from the rest of the world in order to have a game that plays itself out differently, that's essentially a gladiator game. I mean, it's nothing more than a bread and circus thing. But when you look at those performance measures of how people are performing in their art and professional sports, you realize that there are numbers that can give you an evaluation of how well people are doing, but those numbers are relative to other people doing the same thing, and the protocols that they follow in professional sport are always the same. If you're looking at baseball, you don't pull the number of balls and strikes for this batter out of a hat. It's always 4 balls or 3 strikes per at-bat. And if you can keep fouling things off, you can get a lot more strikes than 3 that come down thrown from the pitcher to the batter. But anytime the batter takes 4 balls and takes a walk to first base because the pitcher did not get the ball over the plate, it's a demerit on the pitcher and a merit in the on-base percentage of the batter, but the batter doesn't get credit for a hit, even though he got to first base on a walk, same as if he had gotten to first base on a single. So the path to get to first base doesn't matter so much as getting there in the first place. Now, first base in baseball is a real interesting place, but first base in the sense of Paradise by the Dashboard Light by Meatloaf is a whole nother different game, and everybody tries to get to first base with a date. And the song from Meatloaf is such a good song about the allegory of using a sports atmosphere to describe real life that it can become the template for the new way, or a template for the new way. And so when you take the allegories of one form of life, baseball, and use the measurement metrics and apply them to another form of life, love, well, you put the desires, you line them up, and you let the games play. And you don't tell people they can't be in love with another person, because that's silly. Love doesn't discriminate between who's in love with who. You know it when you got it, and it makes you feel good. But nowadays, people are so bent on prescribing how-to everybody that they lose the ability to realize that when you're immersed in a situation, it doesn't matter how to. You'll do it any way you can to be there, because there's nothing like being in love. And if you've got another person and the two of you are so focused around each other that you really have shut off the world and focus in a sphere of two people meeting and exploring and coming to grips with the reality of a brand new love relationship, it makes everything else better in the world that you're dealing with. But right now, the world that we're dealing with is one that's based on a duality that says you can't love, you have to hate. And if you're trying to love too much, it makes you a racist. And if you're a racist, you hate everything. But we've got groups against anti-racists, and they're called Antifa, and they beat up the racists so that they're afraid of everyone and don't keep pushing race. I don't get the world. I don't get the world at all. I think the world is a confusion deliberately laid out there so that we don't have time to get around to what things really matter. And what matters to me? What matters to me? I don't know. That's a good question. What matters to me? I am a sovereign. I am a universal sovereign of the living earth, but we folded that church back in 2011, 2012 area, because I realized that religion was not a way of going about things. It was a way of hiding things under a term that everybody knew what it meant, so that you could get away things by changing the meaning of words, but it's not the meaning of words that we're trying to change. It's the meaning of hearts and minds. And to change the hearts and minds of people to get to a system that's fair, open, honest, and that is something that we can do by group theory, but it requires big groups of lots of people, and that doesn't function very well on human scale. So getting group theory to function on human scale is a matter of working with small human scale groups and learning the interactions of how those groups interact with each other, and making it so that the individuals who are part of the group feel comfortable to speak in behalf of the group, and that the group represents the humans who are part of the system, or should I say the persons who are part of the system, because we need to discriminate between the term humans and the word persons, because there's a lot more persons involved in the legal systems that we have of things than just us humans. But us humans, because of our voice box and our opposable thumbs, are the only ones at the plateau who are allowed to speak, mostly because of the voice box and the opposable thumbs. We can speak and we can act. But if our actions are not in collusion with our thoughts and our speaking, we get called hypocrites. But we get called hypocrites anyway, because anybody who's not listening will find a way of piercing through the veil and finding something that doesn't make sense in the logic terms brought about by the education system that we all learned under, that taught us how not to critically think, but to repeat fabrications of meanings of words and believe in those meanings to the exclusion of all other meanings that the same word can have. And when we're talking the spoken language instead of the written language, it becomes doubly confusing because there are words called homonyms, which have different spellings but the same pronunciation. So I can lie down, or I can tell a lie, or I can use sodium hydroxide, which is called lie, and lie might be spelled differently. And if you're reading the word lie and it's Lye, you know I'm talking chemistry about sodium hydroxide, and I'm not lying to you, but I could be lying to you about lie. I could say that lye was an acid, and that would be a lie because lye is a base. But lye is a base. Why is it a base? Because of the definition that we have for acid and base. Now, does the chemical definition of the terms acid and base have anything to do with the basis set for philosophy that we base all of our thought conclusions on? I wonder. I wonder how many terms have been co-opted into the rabbit holes of different professions so that those terms are used in a completely different way than the meaning that commonsensically we get from using those words in average conversation. And in fact, if you go pull a Black's Law dictionary off the shelf of your local library or legal library, because libraries around don't seem to carry important books anymore, you can look them up on the internet, and on the internet, Google can change them. So all these books that were scanned into the computer can now change, publish a facsimile image of what was in the book, and I can be reading the book in my hand and reading the book online, and the words say two different things because Google has gamed the software. So how do I know what is real and what is true for myself, especially when I've gone to the depth of exploring a topic, inorganic chemistry, to the point where I know the topic better than anyone else in the world? And since I know the topic better than anyone else in the world, I have to bring people up to speed just to have a conversation. And I can do that, but the conversations I can have with people who are up to speed on the language that I understand is not in the reality of how I connect things in my own mind. And people tell me things that I have trouble accepting as true. And it gets me to thinking, if I have trouble accepting it as true, but somebody else has no problem accepting it as a fact, if I burst their bubble and tell them it's not true, but don't give them a truth to hold on to as a substitute for the bubble that I just burst, they get angry and rage and tell me I'm wrong and it can't be, and raise their voices because they don't want to think through what I'm saying to change the whole picture. No, they want it streamlined for them so they can get there from here without doing the work. And everybody knows the line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Only in quantum mechanics, it's not. You can get between 2 points without actually being anywhere between those 2 points. And it's a phenomena called non-local behavior. Spooky action at a distance is what Einstein called it. And since Einstein just showed up in the door, he gets show credits. Einstein was a very, very bright human being. And everything you've been taught about Albert Einstein is a myth. And I say that from a heart that truly, truly was destroyed in finding the depth of the myth of Einstein not being the truth about Einstein, and finding that most of the quotations attributed to Einstein were attributed to Einstein because he was like the comedian of the times who made fun of other people's ideas, and it would be like taking the history of the 1960s from the viewpoint of Lenny Bruce and running with it. Now, for those of you who are not aware of who Lenny Bruce was one of the funniest comedians of the 1960s, but he had a problem with the 13 words you're not supposed to say on air on the radio. And nowadays we find that funny. It's anything goes. They can't censor the airwaves because we're cursing. They can censor the airwaves because they don't like what we're saying and don't want word to get out. And so this is the new way on Steampunk Radio. And I'm Dr. Lenny Time, and I'm your host. And we've been talking for a half an hour of ramble, and I haven't even gotten to the subject of the show today, which is kind of funny. But in the pre-show, we were talking about the idea that Americans would rather whine about things and problems than actually accept that there's a way to change and get out of the problems, but it might require a little bit of work. And the idea that an American should put in a little bit of work to get their way more than screaming and complaining and throwing a fit. Well, that's not how things work. In America, you scream and complain and throw a fit, and the majority says, "Oh, you poor person," and gives you what you're complaining about to shut you up so you'll go away and not complain so that they can do it just how they want to do it, and nothing ever really changes. So the question came about this morning, if you're going to talk about doing things a different way and start making changes, well, are you making cosmetic changes to make yourself feel better, or are you making changes that might be worth something? And if you take people and change the way they do things without giving them any options, are you doing them any service at all? So I would like to invite anyone in the chat room to mic in and take me up on the conversation, and let's talk about the expectations of people to change or not change and see where we go for a little while. And then I want to play a video that talks about change and go into what they mean about change versus what we mean about change. Bob.
Hey, my experience comes from the workplace and implementing different processes, updating technologies. We found that under most circumstances, majority of people resisted the change, and there was complaint in the organization. I found if we took a different approach and came and explained that we have something that's going to make their life easier, a lot of repetition would get eliminated, and there'd be a lot more productivity for the individual. Taking it from that approach, it made acceptance of change a lot easier. So what ends up motivating change is, I believe, a great driver of people starting to engage in some form of group participation. If we look at the elections as an example in the United States, that was derived based on a need for a change from the existing system. So whether it was applied correctly or not, there was a voice, which is half the country, saying that we've had enough and we want change. Now, the other half, I believe, are after a similar objective, but the approach that is going to be taken by the different groups apparently seems to be different to both parties. And history has shown us there hasn't really been that much difference going between the different parties. What is very apparent is the division that's been created in the country because of this. So the real change wasn't what people were trying to speak towards. It became the division. That was the change that is really apparent and relevant, in my opinion. So the dynamic of change, it starts by enticing people that there's going to be benefits for them after the change. And right now we're experiencing a very radical shift because the people who have come in power are not abiding by the regular norms of the system, which is disrupting the system, and it's shaking out a lot of the weaknesses from it. And a big part of it is exposure of people in power abusing other people. And what we've been discussing in chat is how men in power abuse women. They sexually take advantage of them, which becomes rape. And the system that protects these individuals by discrediting the victims. And it's gotten to the point where the victims aren't looked at real human beings who've suffered through a horrific experience, not really realizing what's happening to them. I've witnessed this in Dubai openly. So it definitely exists, and maybe it's not as prevalent in different parts of the world. But regardless of that, to put a woman into that position, and I'm not saying men don't go through it, but it's mostly women that have been taken advantage of, and children. And this is what's being exposed. This is going to be the biggest thing that comes to surface that humanity will not tolerate, is abuse of children.
So we need to treat power differently, and we need to change the power structure because the power structure currently is overwhelming in the abuse of not only women and children, but anyone who don't follow in the organizational order structure of that power.
I agree with you, and everybody's very aware of what the issues are, but it's coming up with the solutions, and the solutions have to work almost backwards to get to where we're trying to drive to.
Let me put on the video that I was referring to earlier, which is a presentation by one side of a political debate that is presenting itself. And then afterwards, I'd like to talk about the direction of politics, not so much from a democracy standpoint, but from a power structure, power versus force standpoint, because there's a lot of stuff you're saying that the video is going to comment on, and then we will see what's going on. So, is it going to play? No, something's wrong where I put it into, there we go.
We are witnessing a total political system failure in America. If you're anything like me, you may find yourself constantly overwhelmed by everything that's wrong with politics. And when I say politics, I'm not talking about Democrats or Republicans. I'm talking about the flaws that exist in our political system, regardless of which party is in power. And I know it's hard to talk about politics these days, but look, the government is ours. We pay for it, so it needs to.
By the way, before she gets into it, this is Jennifer Lawrence, who people might know from the Hunger Games. And this video came out over the weekend, and I'm not quite sure how to take it, but I realized that I didn't tell the audience who was talking, and it's really important to know that.
For us. And right now it doesn't. And I mean, it really doesn't. So what's going on here? Is it Russian meddling in social media? Is it him? Is it her? No. Those two were the least popular presidential candidates since they began keeping track of such things. Only 4% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in Congress now. Just 4%. America is no longer even considered a full democracy. We are witnessing a total political system failure in America, which is the complete opposite of what our nation's founders had in mind. So I'm going to show you 3 lines that show what's causing this failure, how we can fix it, and what you can do about it. So here's your first line. What I want you to do is take any issue you really care about and picture it on this line. This line comes from a Princeton University study that shows how public opinion influences the laws that Congress does or doesn't pass. They looked at 1,800 public opinion polls over a 20-year period, and we took their data and plotted it in this chart. See this horizontal line? That shows public support for a law amongst average Americans. This vertical line? That shows the likelihood of the public support leading to the passage of a law. When you plot it for the average American, you get a line that looks like this. There's your issue sitting on that line. If there is 0 support for a law, there's about a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. And if there is 100% support for something, the most popular thing ever, there's still a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. So the line is horizontal because no matter how much support there is among average Americans, there's still a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass that law. Princeton determined that the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. How in the hell does that happen? Consider this. Politicians are spending up to 70% of their time raising funds for re-election after they get into office. Why? Because in order to win a seat in the Senate in some races, you would have to raise $45,000 every single day, 365 days a year for 6 years to raise enough money to win. Now consider that only 0.05% of Americans give more than $10,000 to politics. And then you see why politicians have become completely dependent on the 0.05% of Americans, billionaires and special interest groups, who fund their campaigns. Meanwhile, you've got lobbyists writing our laws and donating to the politicians who pass them. We have a 2-party duopoly of Democrats and Republicans that makes it so that independents can't win, while the American people are leaving the major parties in droves. As you can see here, nearly half of American voters are now registered independent. And then there's gerrymandering, with politicians drawing the boundaries of their own voting districts into crazy shapes designed to prevent competition. Today, only 14% of House campaigns are actually competitive. 86% of them are not. And we wonder why young people feel that their vote doesn't matter. I've covered a lot here, but it all adds up to this vast ring of influence over our elected leaders. It's a corrupt system in which we, the people, have near zero influence over our own government. And that is sad. That is not the country I feel like I grew up in. But what's worse is that by allowing this to happen, we are causing the failure of the most important issues facing our nation. We're wasting trillions of dollars a year on fraud and abuse in our own government. 1 in 5 American children live in poverty. Our healthcare is the most expensive in the world. We have more people in prison per capita than Russia and China. We're losing jobs to the rest of the world, and we're not even doing enough to keep our air and our water clean for our children. America was founded on the promise of self-governance, but instead we have statistically non-significant impact on public policy. So the question is, how do we unrig this system? I'm obsessed with this idea, not just of unrigging it, but actually fixing it. That's when I met Josh.
This is it. This is the issue behind the issues. If we fix the system, we'll have so much more power to fix everything else. So I spoke to some of the most brilliant people in the country. Constitutional scholar Lawrence Lessig, Zephyr Teachout, and dozens of other constitutional scholars and experts and strategists. They all said the same thing. You could pass a law that would stop political bribery and fix our broken elections, and if you could do that, you could wrest power away from the corrupt establishment and put it back in the hands of the people. Here's how you fix our broken elections. End gerrymandering with independent redistricting commissions.
Create ranked choice voting so third parties and independents can run and win.
Implement automatic voter registration and vote from home.
And here's how we can crack down on political bribery. Overhaul lobbying and ethics laws and close the revolving door so politicians can't be bribed with high-paying job offers.
Mandate full transparency of political spending so we know who's trying to buy influence.
Give every voter a $50 or $100 tax voucher so politicians spend time fundraising from their constituents, not just that 0.05% that I talked about earlier.
If you could pass even just some of these reforms, you would undo that ring of influence and begin to reinstate we the people as the most important influence over our elected leaders. So we took all of these reforms and put them in a model law and named it the Anti-Corruption Act. And get this, 87% of Americans support making the Anti-Corruption Act the law of the land. Look at the breakdown. 91% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans. It's incredible. Now you might be thinking 9 out of 10 Americans. Surely Congress will pass it. But on this issue, more than any other issue, it's like asking the fox to put a lock on the henhouse. Politicians won in the current system, and they have an incentive not to fix it. So we need to go around Congress, in this case, by passing anti-corruption acts in cities and states all across America. Now, every time I say this, people look at me and say, how does passing city and state laws lead to fixing all of these problems with the federal government?
Can I do this part?
Go for it.
So, first of all, the U.S. Constitution gives states sole control over how elections are run, even federal elections. So when we fix gerrymandering or election laws, that fixes the federal election in each state. That means that by going state by state, we have an immediate impact on how we elect Congress and how we hold them accountable. But there's more, and that brings us to our second line. This line is from a Bloomberg News study. It finds that throughout American history, passing state laws leads to federal victory. Let me show you what I mean. This chart shows the number of states over time that pass laws giving women the right to vote. When it hits the right side of the chart, that's the federal victory. Okay, now I want you to watch the blue line. We're going to do this again with interracial marriage. There were a few states in the Northeast that made it legal decades ago, and centuries go by, and we hit this blue line where all of a sudden there's a rush of activity, which leads pretty quickly to federal passage. So here we are again with same-sex marriage. One state, Massachusetts, for many years. A couple decades later, we hit that blue line, a jump in state activity and federal passage. This isn't about these issues. This is about a winning political strategy. The crucial finding in the Bloomberg study is that a key event, often a court decision or a grassroots campaign reaching maturity, triggers a rush of state activity that ultimately leads to a change in federal law. So fixing this problem is possible, but how do we create our trigger moment for this issue? Well, the grassroots campaign from the study, that's Represent Us. We're bringing conservatives and progressives together to pass anti-corruption laws all across America using 3 strategic innovations: right-left coalitions, calling out corruption, and building a movement, a big movement. And I'm gonna break them down for you.
Can I do this part?
No. First, right-left. This is how people self-identify in America. This isn't party identification. This is how you feel politically. And as you can see, it's 25% liberal, 36% conservative, and 34% moderate. But for the past 40 years on the reforms I've outlined, it's liberals speaking to liberals using liberal language with liberal messengers, liberal. I just had to say that one more time. And you're just not gonna change the political power structure of America with 25% of the people. Fixing corruption requires that we enlist all Americans, liberal, conservatives, and moderates who, as we've shown, overwhelmingly support reform. Number two, corruption. When we talk about money in politics, gerrymandering, democracy, campaign finance reform, most people just tune out. But people are fired up about corruption. And number three, we must build a movement, a big movement comprised of all kinds of people from all across America fighting to pass anti-corruption laws, and then make sure they are implemented and protected. So again, liberals and conservatives working together, corruption, and build a movement. This is the foundation of Represent Us. We believe the government should work for every American, not just a handful of billionaires and special interests. But it's not just an idea. In a few years, we've already racked up 85 wins all across the country. And if we can get those 85 wins to 850 wins, we can fix our corrupt political system, save America, and get to work on fixing everything else that's broken in our country. This is how we build this movement big enough to trigger that rush of state activity that leads to a change in federal law. And that brings us to our last line. Right now, this is you. And right now, these are all of the ways that you can help us go state by state, city by city, to fix the corruption in American politics. Volunteer and join a Represent Us chapter. Or, if that's not your thing, join the Commonwealth and make a monthly donation in support of someone who does volunteer. 100% of your money goes straight to passing these laws, not to overhead or our expenses. Every voice matters. Your voice matters. If you do nothing, nothing changes. But if we all do a little, we can win together. So the only question left is this. Will you cross that line? Join us at represent.us.
Wow, that was Jennifer Lawrence, an actress, telling us how to fix the political system that was kind of destroyed by Ronald Reagan, an actor coming into power in 1980. So we've gone full circle of paying attention to actors to paying attention to actors, and everything is in the domain of Hollyweird. And Hollyweird has gotten weirder and weirder and weirder, and there's all sorts of things that have been coming out. And I was given that video and asked to evaluate whether or not it makes any sense at all. And in listening to that video now for the second time, which is the first time I got to hear it listening to it, because the first time you listen to something, you get it either charmed or you get it strange. And when you get it strange, you gotta decide whether you're going to pay any attention to it or not. And you don't necessarily get it charmed if you got it strange the first time, and then you get it strange the second time, and then, gee, if you get it strange the third time, it's absolutely beyond the kin that you're getting it three times, and you got to consider it at that point. But if you get two stranges in a row and the third time is charmed, then it starts to give you a slightly different perspective on what's being said. And there's a number of different things being said in that video that I totally agree with on a political scale. And there's a number of things in that video that are so offensive to me that I'd like to say, no way, Jose, I'm never going to be part of that. But the intuitive in me looks at what we heard Jennifer Lawrence present there and goes back 2 years ago to when Cynthia McKinney and Robert David Steele were presenting Unreg. And in watching how they tried to unreg the system 2 years ago and the influence that Unreg had on the political system for the 2016 election, tells me that there is some value to the approach that they're taking from a populist organization, but that's the whole thing. They are organizing a movement, and nature self-organizes movements. And so the new way is very much a movement, just like the Represent Us group, except in Represent Us, they want you to choose them to represent you. We're not going to play that game in the new way. You're sovereign. I'm sovereign. Each of us are sovereign, and how we represent ourselves is very, very much important on human scale. And if we choose to allow each other to represent us on something more than human scale, then we have to have the deep conversations to get to know each other, to understand why there might be differences in a thought, and to take all sides of different arguments rather than a single side. But in the microcosm, you can't not take a single side. And so everybody is correct in what they're thinking in their own mind. And the set of facts and the organization of what's really the truth is way more complex than just the assemblage of facts. The assemblage of facts is like mass, and you need all those facts to be assembled in there so that you can create the basis set. But the form that you assemble the mass is just as important as how the mass is formed. And so as you're collecting your mass and shaping it into a form, there are going to be things put on the table that aren't necessarily agreeable with everybody who's creating the meal. But if a meal is created by an entire orchestra and everybody's instrument entitles them to bring something to put on the table, the bassoon is going to bring something quite a bit different from the tuba. And so if the tuba comes in first and puts down a huge watermelon in the middle of the table, it's not going to leave a whole lot of room for the people who get there later, like the piccolo, who maybe the piccolo only has some hors d'oeuvres, but it's still a contribution to the whole, and everybody's contribution to the whole needs to be heard and handled firsthand from an objective viewpoint. But then personal situations deviate, and we all learn from experience. Sometimes we're not working within the norm. And if you're not working within the norm, you're working outside of it, understand that you're still human and you are entitled to believe exactly what you believe in the moment you're believing it. And for other people to forcibly change your views without hearing you out just doesn't make it on human scale. Everything needs to be heard and teased out from different perspectives. But then once all the perspectives are heard, we stand back to the jumble and don't invalidate a perspective because it doesn't agree with where the group is coming from. If a perspective is heard and considered and has value and merit, it's part it has to be addressed to have a good working solution. And if you just ramrod the working solution over people because some victims have higher rights than other victims, we're playing the system game again. Everybody's a victim and nobody's a victim. So being the victim and not being the victim at the same time means we need different games than victim games. So everybody's a victim, nobody's a victim, or the victims have a voice that needs to be recompensed, but not with the propagation of the solution that made them victims in the first place. And by the way, the whole idea of what this society is about can be defined by the way hush money is given to cover up bad actions. And as long as people will take payoffs to be silent, you're going to have this silence bought by money that's part of the information sequestration. And what goes on is that the system is so set up to reward unfair accusations that if it sounds good, no matter how fair it is, the people want justice, and word has to come out organically, but it can't because the methods that we have for organic behavior are non-functional because we don't operate on human scale. And so maybe we need to take that perspective of what organic behavior is and look at it from a different way of perspective. Because if something comes from nature, nature has a lot of harsh realities that humans don't necessarily like. But on the other hand, humans don't control the boat in nature. Nature controls her own boat. But each human should control our own boat also. And right now we have leadership that is just totally out of control. And so if the leadership is out of control, we have to step up into the void and be new leaders. And that means addressing serious issues when they come up and being able to, in the moment, have all the passion of addressing that issue and then stepping back from it after the heat and generation of the rhythms have been acknowledged, and then at that point go out and fix the brokenness of the system. But we can't do it from within the system that's broken without changing the rules on the fly. And changing the rules on the fly, well, we're going to have to come to a point where we reset a lot of different rules, because the idea of a meritocracy doesn't involve people holding positions and spending their effort protecting the positions that they hold rather than doing the work of the position that they hold. And I think it's time to look at the whole structure that we have, where everybody looks at the realm of what they do and decides at what level of human interaction they work at. And from the level of your individual human interaction, represent yourself and all of those groups that you're a member of, and try and pare down to where you as an individual person disagrees with the philosophy of the group that you're representing. And let's have some discussion on those issues where we are in conflict with the groups that we represent, and work the group theory from human scale upward into bigger scales. Now, one of the failings of the new way that I've noticed is that it takes a lot of time to be involved, and people who have obligations to work in the working world of the reality that exists do not have the physical time to change their reality of time and space to fold themselves into the possibilities that can exist that are different from the way things are. And they've been sold a bill of goods that says life is fair and that the rules are set up to reward you being a good person who does things fairly. The rules are purchased by corporate America, and they're set up to pit everybody against each other for a small amount of rewards when there's enough reward available in the system, sans the greed, to give everybody an extremely comfortable existence and use maybe a third of the material that we currently use. It's just a matter of looking at the waste systems and reprocessing the wastes into raw materials and creating circular loops. But the circular loops don't necessarily follow business theory of profit every quarter more than every previous quarter, which is asking for a finite earth to produce unlimited production. We really do live in a land of abundance, but to get to that abundance requires us to give up some of the things that we just blow through without thinking and then change the representation of what we believe to fit the new form of how things are. And so it used to be that there was a major problem with peak oil, and that we were going to run the system completely out of oil, and oil that is pumped from the ground is the lubricant between the tectonic plates. So peak oil just happens to coexist at a time when there's all sorts of volcanoes and earthquakes running, and a lot of physiology of the living earth is changing because of the depletion of the resource of oil that was the lubricant that living earth used to make sure she didn't have arthritis and could make internal shifts that didn't rub and create earthquakes. And the vibrations that we have, the whole range of the spectrum of frequency, we need to rethink how we use those frequencies, because we're working in vibrations in 5G that literally vibrate water. Now, when you literally vibrate water, we have a very common term for that. We use it all the time. It's called cooking. And when we cook in the kitchen, we're always changing the phase of water from liquid to gas and gas to liquid. Heck, just pouring a cup of coffee in the morning, if you extract it through freshly ground beans, is a matter of changing the phase of the water to extract certain compounds out of the beans in order to give you those compounds that can fuel your system to get you to caffeine levels that allow you to talk on the radio and say, this is New Way. I'm Dr. Lenny Time. You're listening to Steampunk Radio on your TuneIn app, Steam with 2 E's. You can also find Dr. Lenny Time on Steemit.com. And on Steemit.com, I put out some memes and ideas and start developing some of the cartoon physics that you see in the New Way. Because I'm at the point where real physics and cartoon physics have to be the same stuff, because they've been hiding too many things in real physics to accomplish what is accomplished in the world with the belief that we could do it the way we were taught it's done. And it doesn't make sense. If you start doing the mass balancing and you start looking at the arrangement of resources and where they go and how they make things and what the total mass balance of those resources are, you find that there's not that many resources used as there are resources wasted. But the form of the waste of resources is acceptable losses to people who are only interested in monetizing everything and working under a system where money rules. But if money doesn't rule, the first thing we have to worry about is redistributing the land so that local communities own the land where they live. And this has always been that way through history. It isn't until the banksters took over and changed the whole idea that everything has to be run through money and created a middleman that steps between the land in a way that doesn't work for those of us being empired upon. And so coming back to human scale and coming up with definitions of things requires creative crypto fiction to come back into the reality of the nonsense and change the way things are done. Now, personally, I listen to Jennifer Lawrence talk about fixing the system, and we know the system's already fixed, and it's doing exactly what it's meant to do, and that's give say to other people who are better organized and have more money to spend. And so what she's doing is a very, very good thing from the standpoint of what I'm doing about changing how the system would work if we could fix the system. But let's face it, the system is so badly flawed that we need a new base system, and it has to come from human scale up, not from the top down. And Jennifer Lawrence, as pretty as she is, represents a system that believes in the way it is and wants to recompensate the victims and make them whole in a system that keeps them as victims forever. And we can't allow that. We have to change the rules, and we have to go very, very, very harsh on people who make other people victims. But we also have to go very, very, very harsh on false accusations. And instead of going very, very, very harsh, maybe we go very, very, very lenient and have some sort of an amnesty program where everybody can do some sort of a confessional and get it out of their system, and then we can decide rules based on the actuality of what we've done rather than the mirage of he said, she said, while hiding all the pertinent information, which the system does in every single field of knowledge that we've been taught. And maybe it's time to come up with some sort of class action been taught in school about the power structures that we have is a complete fraud. It doesn't work that way. And it would be nice if it did work that way, and having people believe that it does work that way is very helpful to the powers that be that want us to make us think it works that way. But the only way this can possibly work is by each of us being the director of our own orchestra and assembling a crew where, as a member of somebody else's orchestra, we work refining our own instruments to play so that when the 88 pieces come together, we can all be in the same musical interlude. But we've got some very special, exceptional people that we've acquired here, and giving those people the ability to think exactly how they think and listening to them is going to give you a better mechanism for approaching the problem than shutting them down and discounting their opinions. But people should have to earn the right to be able to express their opinion in some sort of courtroom of established fact. And we don't really have a courtroom of established fact because every different field of endeavor has its own rules, and most of them use different terms to mean the same thing. And so I've got Einstein here attacking the cord of the computer, and he's never attacking the cord of a computer. So we must have gotten him worked up with the energy of the chat room, that I'm glad I don't go into the chat room when I'm talking on the air, because it's a place that has some interesting dangers to a radio talk show host. But the kiddies pick it up right away, and I feel sympathy and empathy for everyone involved because it is an important topic And it should be talked about on air, but we're not ready to do that yet because that's not the way of the world. And you can only get beaten up for expressing opinions that don't necessarily agree with other people. But it's important that every individual opinion, no matter where it comes from, be heard as another perspective, because while things are going to break into 60-40 or 40-60, if you're not hearing those different perspectives of how things go, you're never going to hear the tangents of reality that take you places to get the true solutions. And to solve a problem as major as the one that we've had is going to take time, because we've managed to build distrust in the whole system. And the distrust comes from having different personal experiences with people who haven't earned their way to where they are, but spend their time protecting the domain of where they are, so that other people have to always fight an uphill battle. And battles, that might be part of the problem too, is we're so conditioned to battle mindset by our language and occupation of how we deal with things, that the language itself pushes us to try and establish right from wrong in an absolute sense, when in a relative sense, there's depth of perception that influences everything. And the perspective that is out there in the liberal community and the perspective that is out there in the conservative community are so antithetical to each other that the border of the playing field has come to a place where there's no room for ethics or morals or other things, and that the underhandedness of the system to bring people down knows no bounds whatsoever. And by playing in the system for as long as we've been playing in the system, sometimes we bring ourselves down by the rules of thought and belief that require us to express difficult opinions in unsocially acceptable ways, so that the court of opinion actually doesn't judge the right topic that's under conversation. And by taking everything personally when it's not meant to be personal, we do ourselves a lot of damage. But by not taking it personally and ignoring the issue, I wonder if we also do ourselves damage, so that in not addressing issues on a personal basis, but understanding the depth of the persona involved in the issue, it becomes difficult to understand sometimes that it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's just a matter of civil decency sometimes. And that the opinions that people have developed get hardened by personal experience. And there's a whole application of the form of love that doesn't necessarily underlie things going on. Because of the polarity of the situation, hate and love have been made to be opposites, but for everyone arrested for a hate crime, there should be somebody arrested for a love crime, and that doesn't make any sense. So hate and love can't be opposite. So what is it that really is driving people in the system? I think that the opposite of love is fear, and that part of the problem that we're having is that the fear porn and the hope porn have reached the potential where it's not real. And on an individual basis, we're dealing with issues that are very real to us. But when we bring them out on a social basis, other people's reality are only what they've learned on television and in the movies, and from their own limited personal experiences. And now we're being taught to question those limited personal experiences by them changing the computer algorithms that give us the base information that we work on. And so when I go to a PDF file and I read in a book a fact that strikes me as different from how I remember it, and then I go to the shelf and I open the book, and the book on the shelf says something different than what it says in the PDF file, I think, oh, okay, they've changed the PDF file. Somebody's trying to do something and pull one over on me. But when I go back to the book and see that the book on the shelf actually does agree with the PDF file, and the book that I've pulled off the shelf is a King James version of the Bible, and it talks about the wolf and the lamb, and I'm still busy having read that Bible, knowing that when I translated it, it said lion and lamb, and that I knew my translation because it was part of my training in becoming a Jedi warrior or whatever it is that I am. You never know what you are until you imagine yourself as it. And now that we've had Star Wars and everybody can understand in their imagination the concept of a Jedi warrior, notice how the Resistance is played as good and the Empire is played as evil. The Empire is not totally evil, and the Resistance is not totally good. And just the need to define things in terms of good and evil puts some stress into our ability to judge our own morality and our ethics. And so, whereas we already can judge physics and say, maybe we should be considering cartoon physics, maybe we should also consider some cartoon ethics, because that's what we get from a Hollywood movie is cartoon ethics. And if we all believe we're in a hero's journey and that things end the way they end in the movies, well then all they have to do is rewrite the end of the plot and you've got something different. Now, we were yesterday learning about a movie in which they didn't release it. It was a science fiction movie with Natalie Wood and Christopher Walken and Louise Fletcher. It was called Brainstorm. And Brainstorm was going to teach us a bit about some of the advanced technologies that were being developed. And the director of the movie was charged with taking the advanced technologies that were developed and making them real to a movie watching audience. And he came up with a process where the actors were in tune with each other and communicating using this process and going into great depth in putting things together for opening clarity in people's minds. And then Christopher Walken and Natalie Wood, and her husband, Robert, it takes a thief, Wagner, went on a boating trip and she died. And nobody answered the mystery of how she died or what she died, but then they canceled the film. And the insurance company Lloyd's of London didn't want to pay for the hardship insurance of canceling the film. And the director didn't want the film canceled because he had shot all the footage. And so it turns out Lloyd's of London released the movie instead of the movie studio, and it never got full release and nobody's ever heard of it. But we all need to watch that movie because what came out in that movie, written in the early 90s or late 80s or sometime, I don't know when Natalie Wood actually died, But however it works is however it works, and they're changing the history of the fabric of reality to confuse us in such a way that the idea of confusing us becomes something really, really difficult. And so sometimes you got to shake your head and say, why did you go look at the chat room? Because you know you're not supposed to go there on show, because it always takes you out of the moment and puts you into the chat room moment. And the chat room is way, way higher thinking than the radio air station room. The radio air station room is just an ornery radio room where people can mic in and become ornery and have some sort of a discussion about the realities of the time frame, but time as the avenger. That's how we started this. And I don't think time works the way we've been explained that time works. And I think that time travel is a factor of scale. And so that if you find yourself on a human world in a different place, on a different scale, that what you find is that the reality of the situation is nothing like what you think it is, and nothing is real, and there's nothing to get hung about, but that each time we descend into a smaller reality, we're asked to work on a micro problem, that the human resolution of the micro problem is a compilation of many different circuits coming together, and the circuits that work together well on a micro scale can then be duplicated on a macro scale, so that each time we come to a decision point where something happens, we can choose either the left path or the right path. And whether we go on the left-hand path or the right-hand path makes absolutely no difference most of the time. And the left-hand path and the right-hand path return to the same path in the general sphere of things. And it's like getting on an 8-lane highway or taking the path that cuts you off and goes through a local town. And if you go through the local town, you might have to stop at some stoplights, and you might stop at a restaurant and have lunch or go do some shopping. But then you get back onto the 8-lane highway and you're going Autobahn speeds, and everything flashes by you at the speed of light. And the speed of light is not a constant. The color of light defines the speed. And so if the speed of light is not constant, and each different color of light travels at a different speed, then we have a problem with the conception of some of the variables. But the variables are a function of scale, and at different scales, the same variables don't have to be in play. But on human scale, humans are a constant. But if human scale is variable and we materialize on larger or smaller Earths as we make decisions that are not the normally chosen path, but something that needs to be worked out, each of us continually go deeper and deeper down our own wormholes to smaller and smaller Earths, where certain issues come to the forefront for resolution. And when they get solved on a small Earth, then we can be teleported back to the next larger Earth, where that resolution now comes into play to fix a more major problem in the system. So that by working on the knife edge of your own reality, you're continually using your 0 point energy to pierce the veil, and it's like using a stitch ripper on an old piece of cloth, where as you start ripping the stitches and the old thread is broken and you pull back the layer, you find that underneath the onion skin is a different piece of onion. And as you work in that level, you pull back that piece of the onion and you find there's another piece of onion. And you continually do that until you reach the point where you come to the conclusion that the onion is it's a farce. It's a comedy routine. The Onion routinely publishes stories that are not true but sound like they could be true. And the major media now seems to have the Onion as its major source of reality. So anything you hear from the media either comes to you directly through the media filter or in opposite form through the truther community filter. And either way, what it is based on something that was created to generate loosh, reaction. And the more reaction that we give to the events that people create for us, the more we're distracted away from the illusion of this reality, which is the reality that you as an individual find yourself in. So you may ask yourself, what is the reality that I find myself in? And you find that the new way is a way of reconsidering the reality to make perceptions include other perspectives that come from different people looking at the same problem from another point of view. And if you don't have the second point of view to contrast the first point of view, it becomes difficult to really feel yourself in the situation you are. But if you live vicariously through the other people that you know, then their story becomes your story, and you start to individually relate to them in ways that you feel they would be open to suggestion and try and influence them in a way that maybe gives them more perspective on the choices that they have to continue doing what they do or changing what they do. But realize that you have a 60-40 split of majority and minority, and then beyond that 60-40 split, it's all made up of individual ones and groups of two. And those ones and twos all need to be considered as part of the sum of the whole. But on a fractal nature, really 3.14 steps is a fractal difference. So in Fibonacci, 1 is the first step, 1 is the second step, 2 is the third step, 3 is the fourth step, 5 is the fifth step. So now we're at 5. 5 minus 3 1/4 is 1.75. And so we're still within the realm of 1, the individual, as long as we truncate the number. But we've actually reached the point where by the time we go up to the number 8, it's hard to get 8 individuals all to have at least 10% of something, when to max out would be to have 12.5% on average. But somebody within the group of the 8 is going to need to spend a little more of their time working on group stuff so that other people don't have to. So at that point where you have a functional group of 8, you almost need a designated leader. And when you move to a functional group of 13, now you need 2 designated leaders. And by the time you get up to 21, 3 designated leaders, and 34 takes you to 5 designated leaders. Resetting your group at 34 back to 1 designated super leader for those 5 means that you can now take the whole thing and scale it up as a package. And I think that resolution of some of what Bob and I were talking about earlier is just getting to the point where you've got 3rd, 4th, and 5th level groups, which are, well, 3rd level group starts at 34. So it's going to take a little while for us to build up to a group of 34. But if we say that the new way is a group of 8 and closing in on a group of 13, whatever level the new way gets to will give us the number of leaders that's needed for the fractal after the next fractal that we're working on, so that by always keeping a consistent ratio of individual leaders who speak as part of the whole of collective, well, let's say there's 9 different groups, somebody gets to be 7 of 9, and they get to speak for that collective that they belong to in the group of higher hierarchy representing the humans from the scale that they come from. So in every case, the humans at human scale get the final buy-off, and that's what would be called voting, not the nonsense that we have now, which, yeah, there's 50% of the population that's blue and 50% of the population that's red, until you consider that there's really like only 23% red and 32% blue, and the other 40% is tired of the system and is beaten bloody purple. Sometimes analogies suffice when real words don't seem to quite fit. I'd like to open up discussion back to the chat room. If anybody's actually paying attention to the radio show and wants to open up and talk about ways that we, as the new way, can look at group theory and find ways to allow the individual people within our group to represent themselves as these corporate scale groups being analyzed through human scale, so that we can do our homework, take an area of interest that we're in, and reformat how it's done so that we can do it so that it works out better for the humans involved. And if we take whole bunches of different endeavors on different scales of human scale, let's start defining what human scale is and how human scale 2nd level and 3rd level and 4th level differ from human scale 1st level, so that at each different level as we grow, the human scale at 1st level always gets consulted in the decisions that they would make, even if it's in retrospect. Coming back and explaining how a decision was made by a higher level community that wasn't necessarily in the benefit of the lower order community, but the lower order communities are greater importance than the higher level communities. But that importance is another question, because there's stuff that's important, and then there's stuff that is urgent. And urgent and important have connotations in our language that make everybody want to drop what they're doing and go to attend to things that are urgent and important. So much that the titles urgent and important get slapped onto things that are really not urgent and not very important. And when we put urgent things ahead of important things, and then the important things fall off because there's so many urgent things to attend to that we're not dealing with the things of importance. We lose out on our scale of quality versus quantity. And I think it's very important in the new way to make sure that at human scale we do things at the highest quality that satisfy us for doing it, and always strive for better quality of the products that we're producing at human scale because it's something good to do. And I'd rather have a radio show that entertains people through controversy and order and chaos than I would to put on a radio show that pays me lots of money to repeat what I've heard from the media and get people riled up against people so that nothing works at human scale and everything has to be dictated at corporate scale. But we have this idea that corporations are persons, and under the law that we work on, at corporate scale law, corporations are persons. And so maybe we should leave the entire field of monetary units to corporations and set up some sort of consistent value of providing living to people who are alive, persons who are alive, that do not involve the extraction of resources from other persons that are alive, and that if it requires resources, there needs to be an exchange, and that the value of the resource exchange comes from the human's ability to work, but at what scale that human work is the scale of human work is a quanta of energy on human scale. And so that different quantas of energy can have the importance, so that a mother who gives birth to a child and raises that child through the first year gets credit for X amount of energy that it would take that provides her enough sustenance to do the rest of the years of the child's life in the same way. And that if we can make life values that are not converted into monetary values, but give people rewards like, oh, you've been on the show for 4 hours, we're going to send somebody to your house to do your dishes, vacuum your floors, and clean your bathroom. Now, I bet most people would spend 4 hours doing work for the new way if somebody was going to clean their house and provide them with maid service, even if it was just once a week for 8 hours of showtime. If we figured out how to do it so that everybody contributed something of value that came from them to the system, and then the values could go to ordering who got more of the equity, it would involve us taking everything that we know about banking and getting rid of the money and creating terms of faith and trust that could be used in a banking system to allow people to qualify for things, but having a minimum floor where you qualified for housing and communications and food and clean water and clean air just by being born. And we have to do something about this abortion issue without just screaming at each other over it. But there are definitely things that go on in people's minds that are different than what goes on in other people's mind. And if you differ in opinion with somebody, it doesn't make you an enemy and the reason for scorn and hatred. And it certainly does not allow arbitrary, unfair attacks on individuals when the playing fields aren't even defined well enough to know what we're talking about. And so sometimes you just feel like a devil dog. Does anybody remember devil dogs? Devil dogs were chocolate cake with vanilla cream in them, made by a company called Drake. And Drake's fruit pies make you feel nice, come in apple and cherry. And very berry makes you feel wise. So Drake's fruit pies make you feel wise. So I remember buying Drake's cakes. Drake's cakes were good stuff, but the real neat thing about Drake's cakes was sometimes they came in a box and there was a baseball card panel on the bottom of the box. And I would get the baseball cards from the panel and get to take them. And I don't remember where my baseball cards eventually ended up getting distributed. I do know that at one point in my life, I took 15 years of mint condition baseball cards and sold them to a dealer for about $10,000 and used that money to put a down payment on the farm that I bought 3 days before I got fired from the job that was supposed to pay for the farm. You know, they could have told me not to close on the house. And the fact that they didn't really pissed me off. And at that point, I still had some trust in the system and was beginning to wonder why nobody that was in a position that I was told to trust acted honorably. And here I was, 30 to 33 years old, making a major life decision on buying a home and not even being warned that my occupation that I had chosen might be having a problem because of perceived aggressions from the management. And I didn't learn a lot about what I know now at that time. I hadn't been exposed to the system. I had come straight out of college, and it was like statutory rape. It really was. They took total advantage of me because I was naive about negotiating. I had a wife who was insistent on geographic location, and the money didn't matter as long as she could be back near home. And we had a place that I really liked the place, but the opportunity to earn money wasn't going to be in the place that we were moving to. And I trusted people who sold me a line of goods who never came through on what they told me. And I went from there to picking up a second job because economically I couldn't handle it with just one job, having bought the farm and then been fired from the job that I had. Oh, by the way, I was fired from a job on Friday and started work in the same job for another company on Monday morning. It was just a matter of accepting an offer from a competitor that had been out there who understood what was going on and wanted to use me in the same way because obviously I had come up with a patent, hadn't been rewarded for the patent that I came up with, and now I needed to come up with another patent to get the reward, and they could pay the fishing string just like someone else. So I ended up going to the community college and started teaching part-time at night at the community college to be a second job from being a professional that would allow me to stay in the farm that I had bought within a year. And I lasted at the new job for 6 months, went back to the old job and worked that one for a year again. But it took me 2 jobs to make ends meet. And I had a wife who was home with 2 young children and running the farm. And me with 2 jobs just didn't have enough time to be home with the family and making ends meet. And so I can see where my children were now part of being neglected by the parents because I had been homeschooling. Well, actually, at that point, I wasn't homeschooling. When my younger son got to the 2nd grade, he got bullied by another student. When we went deeper into the conversation, it turned out that the student doing the bullying was the son of the teacher, and that the teacher was empowering the bullying in the class. and we just had to pull my son out of the classroom because of it. He was coming home in tears every day in second grade about how much he was being bullied, and the school was denying it and saying they wanted to give him ADHD drugs. And we went to do some investigation and found out what was going on. And when we found out that the teacher's son was the bully and the teacher was empowering it, that principal and guidance counselor got called on the carpet, and we started raising holy hell. And when it became that the school establishment stood behind the bully, heck with that, we pulled our son right out of school. So I was homeschooling in part with my wife, working with our second grader, and also trying to run 2 jobs. Oh, and I was involved in politics at the time because NAFTA and GATT were coming on the radar screen. And the job I had doing the research for NASA led me to a job doing analytical chemistry for a nickel mine, local, that gave me a much higher salary and put me in charge of other people. That was a mistake. I'm not a person who should be in charge of people. I had spent my entire time in a laboratory, and most of the people I knew were competent to get their work done. Putting me in a laboratory in charge of 13 people at various levels of competence was something where I had been put beyond my competence. And so I had some problems working in that environment, and one of the people who worked for me ended up committing suicide. And it was something that I was involved in peripherally, and I had my hands totally tied because he had been suspended for drinking on the job, and he had just come back, and one of my other employees reported him to me for drinking on the job again. And I didn't have a choice. I had to look into it and be the person who got him fired. And 2 days later, he was not only fired, he was no longer alive. And I felt terrible because I wouldn't have handled it that way. But the situation that I was put into was very clear on how I had to handle it. And I had been brought up on false sexual harassment charges previously, so I didn't have the latitude of being able to step out of line. And so it gets tough sometimes when people are pointing fingers and saying things, and you don't have the ability to tell truth because they're going to shout over you and not let the truth happen because they're too interested in their own forms of justice. But you know, the nickel mine, everybody was really worried about their jobs anyway, and rightfully so. When NAFTA and GATT passed and Clinton signed off on them, the company that ran the nickel mine closed the mine and went back to Canada. And so we didn't have jobs in the area, but I got hired on to close the plant for 2 years. And I became a consultant where I had my own business. So I was working politics with the Reform Party, and I actually rose to the point where I was treasurer of the Reform Party of Oregon. And so I had a pretty big say in how the political system worked, and I thought I was doing some good. But the dirty baggage of how politics got done left a bad enough taste in my mouth. And as a consultant, what I really wanted to do was work in education. So I went to work for a local zoo developing math and science programs for outstanding children. And about that time, we were making these programs, getting federal grants to train students to follow federal protocols in the collection of data in scientific endeavors. For those kids who in junior high who could handle math and science and were getting bored and wanted a challenge in high school, we trained them with the protocol of collecting bugs or collecting water samples or measuring trees. And we gave them the right tools to do it. And we said, here, figure out how to do this. And then you can, on your summer vacation, collect data with the Federal Forest Service. I call them the Forest Circus now, knowing how they work. or the BLM or the county. There are more than enough ways that we could employ talented children to use their abilities of their talents to get out and do things. But, you know, we were conspired against. There was this thing called No Child Left Behind. That was essentially No Child Gets Ahead, that made it so that the schools didn't want to play with our programs because we were advantaging some children and not everyone. So instead of having a bug zone where we could teach aquatic entomology to a whole bunch of children who knew what was going on and were smart enough to learn, we had to teach it to everybody, including those disadvantaged disruptors in the classroom who wanted to make sure that it wasn't cool for anybody to learn. And so we saw part of the problem firsthand in that the schools no longer wanted to allow their students to take extra time school at the zoo because they wanted control of the system. And then the federal government became a problem also because it turned out that a lot of the students that we trained as 8th and 9th graders to do these protocols, by the time they were juniors and seniors in high school, got pretty good at doing the protocols. And they were threatening the jobs of the lazy SOBs who are in the federal positions, not doing their jobs and just taking the fat paychecks. And so when my friend who was using the children started getting some recognition for this and that, some people started worried that the students were showing them up at their job and they couldn't have that. So they complained and the students no longer got job offers. And it's like, oh, you're in competition with high school students and you still have to cheat to win. I get how this works. So I lost faith in a lot of government employees at that point. There's 3 types of government employees, and there's one type of government employee that I really admire because they're there to do something different. But there's also a group of social climbers who get into the government for their own aggrandizement. And then there's a group of locals who are the people who do the work in the offices and actually maintain the stuff. And it's a fairly prestigious local position to have, to work in rural America for the federal government. But it goes to their heads and you get petty fiefdoms and people making rules on things that they don't even know about, and then creating positions for themselves so that they're at the pinnacle of understanding and getting all the information and hiding it so that they can make their decisions based on their own biases and mess up other people trying to do good work. The system doesn't work because it rewards people for bad behavior and punishes people for good behavior, and then screams about how we should be ethically and morally pure so that we can get raped by those who are not ethically and morally pure and are reaping all the advantages of the system that pretends like we're going to get the rewards when they get the rewards, because it pays to be dishonest in the system that we have, because the more dishonest you are, the more you can advance, and the more you can advance, the more you can use your dishonesty to advantage. And then when you find out how many people are dishonest out there and what they're hiding, it becomes a big game of us against them, and we're not part of the club. So there's a deep state and there's a shallow state, and the shallow state is full of petty dictators and a lot of jealousy and a lot of stuff where if you don't do it the way I think you should do it, I'm going to report you to the law, and the law is going to mess with you to the point where you're going to be harassed so much you can't even be a human being anymore. And so I've had enough of the system, but the system has to change from human scale and ground level. It cannot change by having somebody from outside like Jennifer Lawrence come in and tell us how we should all join an organization called Represent Us and give them our power to control our own destiny. That just doesn't seem like it's the thing to do. And their idea of a left-right coalition is straight out of the playbook from Cynthia McKinney and Robert David Steele in the Unrig game that didn't work, and the call out corruption. Yeah, it's easy to call out corruption, but when you're corrupt and you're calling out somebody else's corruption and hiding your own, don't you think that that might be a slight conflict of interest there? And that maybe calling out your own inequities would be better. But then if you call out your own inequities, you'll get punished for them and game over. And that doesn't work either. So I'm not going to call out my own flaws. It doesn't make sense to me to do that. But some of the stuff that they talked about, their political ideas, gerrymandering, stop gerrymandering. Well, yes, that's true. The organization of how they divide up the counties to the states in order to make congressional district definitely needs to be cookie cuttered and not made into one of these things where a person in the House of Representatives during a census can redesign their district to be foolproof for election. Third person. I don't remember what they were talking about third person. Vote from home. Oh yeah, we have an ID problem with voter ID. So we'll solve that by letting people vote from home, and we'll hook up their ID to our know everything, do everything system, and we'll make sure people get one vote and only one vote, except for more important people who get more votes because you're voting from home and you don't even get to see the system. Rewrite ethics laws. The ethics laws are perfectly fine. It's the ethics that are a problem. And you can rewrite the ethics laws all you want. If you don't do something about people's ethics, you're not going to have that chance. Hey, Kat, I see you're mic'd in. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And speaking of ethics and identities, because I agree with your ethics, I want to promote you and remind everyone where to find you in your blog on Steemit with 2 E's, steemit.com/@ Lenny Time THYME, and you get to see just another dimension of Lenny Time there. So I invite you to check that out, and remember to join us Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern, and I believe it's 3 a.m. in the UK. Excuse me, 3 p.m. in the UK,
and 4 o'clock in Belgium.
That's right.
Amazing how this works. Yeah, they call for transparency, and transparency is a good idea, but how about transparency of all information? The information sequestration that's going on right now is ridiculous. And getting political money out of the system by giving everybody $100 to spend politically and letting all the politicians chase the $100 of political contributions that everybody has is a great big fat joke. Because if I had $100, I would not give it to the political system.
I'd give it to you.
I thank you. I'm not collecting money at this point. However, monetizing the new way into a system that has some legs so that we can go out and do some things in the future is something that I definitely was thinking of doing. So maybe we can design a new way t-shirt or a new way ball cap or new way shoelaces or a new way knife. Yes.
Great if some people with some of these design skills could maybe leave these in the comments on your blog.
Yeah, or come into the Discord chat room and actually keep up with the show behind the show, which I dare not keep up with today because every time I look, took me into a different world of imagination. one where I expected Rod Serling to jump out from behind the corner and sort of tell me that it was a different dimension of space, different dimension of time, different dimension of reality.
Well, the clock does work in orange.
Yeah, it does. And that's another Stanley Kubrick episode that we can talk about. So this is the new way, and we are done.
Toodles!
All right. That was interesting. I did not get a single note the second hour of the show after filling a whole bunch of notes in the first hour. See
Well,
how much?
sorry I haven't been around, and I hope that was not like overkill that you already went there and promoted it, but that's kind of like what I'm supposed to do, so I wanted to make sure I got it in.
No, it was good because I actually like to do that in the last 5 minutes of the show, and I wasn't going to get to it if you didn't come up with it because I was on a roll and figured that talking about how the political system can be changed while using the exact same political system sort of seems like a primary oxymoron, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that we've more or less proven to ourselves that we cannot fix a problem the same way that the problem occurred. At least that's what some old dead guy wrote somewhere, and people picked it up and started repeating it.
Actually, I've got a feline who'll claim that remark.
There you go.
Einstein says he said it.
Well, I won't argue with insane genius.
Yeah, but you can argue with kitty cats who have big egos.
You can, but why bother? You can't win.
Well, I didn't say anything about winning.
Oh, okay.
I don't argue with Einstein. I let Einstein go because Einstein knows what he's talking about. But Einstein doesn't have patience sometime for me. And so, however Einstein wants to deal with it is how Einstein deals with it. And so today, when he was actually attacking the cord on the computer during the show, I found that interesting. I figured it meant he had a lot to say. But then when I gave him the attention to say it, he ran off.
He says, haha, just kidding.